Have you ever felt completely invisible in a room full of people who should be listening to you? That suffocating sensation of having a clear answer, an obvious solution right before your eyes. But when you open your mouth to share, everyone looks at you as if you were speaking an alien language. Worse still, they laugh. Not a laugh of camaraderie, but that cutting laugh that diminishes you, that makes you question whether you really understand anything about the world. You feel the heat rising up your neck, your heart racing, and that cruel internal voice whispering that maybe you really are too different, too inadequate, too simple to be in that space. It's a pain that goes beyond momentary embarrassment. It's a wound that questions your very ability to comprehend reality, to have value, to belong. Now imagine that this didn't happen once, but repeatedly, throughout your entire life, that your way of thinking was labeled as childish, naive, inadequate for the world of serious adults, that each of your insights was dismissed as child's logic, until the day that very same logic saved lives and revealed a truth that no expert could see. This isn't just a story of humiliation and redemption. It's the revolutionary discovery that completely changed our understanding of how human beings learn, think, and develop. When Jean Piaget began studying the wrong answers that children gave in intelligence tests in the early 20th century, everyone around him saw only cognitive failures, proof that young minds were defective and incomplete versions of adult brains. Piaget saw something radically different. He realized that children didn't think incorrectly, they thought differently, following their own sophisticated logic that adults had completely forgotten. This perception, initially ridiculed as romanticization of childhood, proved to be the key to understanding not only how we develop, but how we solve problems, create innovations, and survive in situations that demand perspectives conventional thinking cannot reach. Piaget's most disturbing discovery wasn't about how children learn. It was about how adults unlearn to see the world in ways that can save their lives, and why recovering this capacity can be the difference between being stuck in rigid mental patterns or developing a cognitive flexibility that completely transforms your existence. Today I'm going to show you how a man who was constantly belittled for valuing childlike logic ended up predicting a disaster that no trained officer could anticipate, and how the principles he discovered about cognitive development can free you from mental prisons you didn't even know existed. I'll reveal the exact stages that Piaget identified in human thought development, why you're probably stuck in just one of them without realizing it, and how to access forms of reasoning that your adult mind systematically blocks. More importantly, I'll show you why people who can alternate between different forms of thinking, including those that seem childish or illogical, possess a devastating cognitive advantage in creativity, problem solving, and even survival in critical situations. Geneva, 1920. A young recently graduated psychologist named Jean Piaget accepted a job that nobody else wanted, standardizing intelligence tests developed by Alfred Binet in Parisian schools. The work was considered tedious, mechanical, unworthy of a serious researcher. It basically consisted of repeatedly applying the same test to children of different ages, recording how many got them right or wrong, and compiling statistics. But Piaget, who had graduated in biology before migrating to psychology, possessed a different perspective. While other researchers obsessively focused on correct answers to measure intelligence, Piaget became fascinated by the wrong answers. He began noticing strange patterns. 7-year-old children consistently got certain types of questions wrong, but not randomly. The errors followed a coherent internal logic. Even more intriguing, children of the same age made incredibly similar mistakes, as if they shared a unique way of structuring thought. For example, when Piaget showed young children 2 identical glasses with the same amount of liquid, and then poured the contents of one of them into a taller, narrower glass, something fascinating happened. Children under 7 years old stated with absolute conviction that the taller glass contained more liquid, even though they had watched the researcher simply transfer the liquid right in front of them. It wasn't stupidity or lack of attention. It was a genuinely different way of perceiving and interpreting reality. The height of the liquid completely dominated their perception, overriding the understanding of volume conservation. For a child in this stage of development, the world works through perceptual appearance rather than logical constancy. What you see in the immediate moment is what exists, period. The concept that quantity can remain the same despite changes in appearance simply doesn't exist yet in their cognitive structure. Piaget called this the pre-operational stage, and it wasn't a deficiency. It was a complete and functional way of thinking, perfectly adapted to the needs and capabilities of that developmental period. When Piaget presented these findings to his colleagues in the psychological community, the reaction was predominantly dismissive. Established psychologists argued that he was wasting time documenting obvious developmental deficits rather than focusing on how to accelerate children toward adult reasoning. The prevailing view was that children were essentially incomplete adults, and the goal of education should be to fill them with adult knowledge as quickly as possible. Piaget's suggestion that children actually thought in qualitatively different ways, not just less efficiently, was seen as romantic nonsense. One prominent critic mockingly called his work "philosophy of the nursery" and suggested he return to biology where he belonged. Another said he was attributing too much sophistication to simple cognitive limitations. The academic establishment couldn't accept that what appeared to be errors might actually be windows into alternative cognitive structures with their own internal validity and purpose. But Piaget persisted. Over the following decades, he meticulously documented what he eventually formulated as 4 distinct stages of cognitive development. The first stage, which he called sensoromotor, spans from birth to approximately 2 years. During this period, infants understand the world entirely through physical interactions and sensory experiences. An object that disappears from view literally ceases to exist for them. Around 8 months, they develop object permanence, the understanding that things continue to exist even when not perceived. This seems trivially obvious to adults, but it represents a revolutionary cognitive achievement, the first step in constructing mental representations of reality that go beyond immediate perception. The second stage, pre-operational, extends roughly from ages 2 to 7. Children can now use symbols and language but still think in concrete, perceptually bound ways. They struggle with conservation tasks like the liquid example, cannot reliably take another person's perspective, and tend toward magical thinking where wishes and reality blur. Again, this isn't dysfunction, it's a legitimate cognitive system. The third stage, concrete operational, emerges around age 7 and continues to approximately 11. Children now master conservation, can perform logical operations on concrete objects and situations, understand reversibility, and can classify things into hierarchical categories. However, they still struggle with abstract, hypothetical reasoning. Ask a concrete operational child to reason about something that violates physical reality, or to systematically test all possible combinations in a problem, and they hit a cognitive wall. The fourth stage, formal operational, supposedly develops from age 11 onward and represents adult abstract reasoning. People in this stage can think hypothetically, reason about possibilities that don't exist, use systematic scientific reasoning, and understand abstract concepts like justice, freedom, or mathematical infinity. Piaget believed this was the pinnacle of human cognitive development, the final destination toward which all prior stages were merely preparatory steps. But here's where Piaget's own theory reveals something he himself didn't fully anticipate, and where his critics found their most potent ammunition. As research accumulated over subsequent decades, psychologists discovered that many adults never fully achieve formal operational thinking. Studies showed that only 30 to 35% of adults consistently reason at the formal operational level across different domains. Even more surprising, adults who demonstrate formal operational thinking in familiar areas often regress to concrete operational or even pre-operational thinking when confronted with unfamiliar domains or under stress. A physicist capable of sophisticated abstract reasoning about quantum mechanics might think in remarkably concrete ways about interpersonal relationships. An executive who systematically analyzes business problems might resort to almost magical thinking about health or spirituality. The stages weren't discrete boxes you graduated from and left behind. They were layers that remained accessible throughout life, with people shifting between them depending on context, stress, familiarity, and emotional state. This is where Piaget's critics thought they had him cornered. If adults don't reliably achieve formal operational thinking, and if they regress to earlier stages, doesn't that prove his stage theory is fundamentally flawed? Doesn't it show that these aren't real developmental structures but just artifacts of his particular testing methods? The criticism intensified when cross-cultural studies revealed that formal operational thinking, as Piaget defined it, appeared far less frequently in non-Western cultures and seemed heavily dependent on formal Western schooling. Critics argued he had simply documented the effects of cultural conditioning rather than universal cognitive development. Some abandoned stage theory entirely, proposing that cognitive development is continuous and domain-specific rather than occurring in universal qualitative leaps. Piaget's work, once revolutionary, seemed destined to become a historical footnote, another grand theory that couldn't withstand empirical scrutiny. But there's a twist in this story that Piaget's critics completely missed, and it brings us back to that military incident that nobody saw coming. During World War I, before his work on child development, Piaget served briefly in a support role for the Swiss military. Though Switzerland remained neutral, it maintained armed forces and conducted readiness operations. Piaget, then a young man still primarily focused on biology, was assigned to assist in logistics planning for a mountain garrison. The officers were planning supply routes through alpine terrain for a hypothetical defensive scenario. They had sophisticated topographical maps, military training, and decades of collective experience in mountain warfare. They plotted what they considered the optimal routes based on distance, elevation changes, natural barriers, and strategic considerations. Their analysis was thorough, systematic, formal operational thinking at its finest. Piaget, looking at the same maps, felt something was wrong. He couldn't articulate it clearly at first. It was more of an intuitive discomfort, a perceptual impression rather than a logical analysis. When he finally spoke up, suggesting an alternative route that seemed longer and less efficient by every standard metric, the officers initially thought he was joking. When they realized he was serious, the mockery began. One officer literally said he was thinking like a child who chooses a path because it looks pretty, rather than because it's tactically sound. Another suggested he stick to looking at beetles under microscopes and leave military planning to people who understood warfare. The humiliation was complete and public. Piaget, still in his early 20s, felt that burning shame of being dismissed as fundamentally incompetent in front of people whose respect he sought. Here's what happened next. The officers proceeded with their planned route. During a training exercise weeks later, a sudden weather change created conditions nobody had predicted. The supposedly optimal route became a death trap. Snow accumulation in specific configurations, combined with temperature patterns and wind dynamics, created an avalanche risk that materialized catastrophically. 3 soldiers died. 17 were injured. The alternative route that Piaget had suggested, the one mocked as childlike thinking, would have completely avoided the danger zone. When investigators reconstructed what happened, they discovered something extraordinary. Piaget's route selection hadn't been based on sophisticated formal operational analysis. It had been based on something closer to pre-operational perception. He had looked at the shapes and patterns on the map in a more holistic, less analytically dissected way. Where the officers saw quantifiable variables to be systematically evaluated, Piaget saw configurations and relationships that triggered an instinctive recognition of danger patterns. His less cognitively sophisticated approach, at least by conventional definitions, had perceived something that more advanced analytical thinking completely missed. This incident haunted Piaget for years and directly influenced his later theoretical work, though he rarely discussed the connection explicitly. It crystallized for him a question that would drive decades of research. Why do more advanced cognitive stages sometimes fail where supposedly primitive thinking succeeds? The conventional assumption was that formal operational abstract thinking was superior in every way to earlier stages. But Piaget began to suspect something different. Perhaps each cognitive stage wasn't just a stepping stone to the next, but a distinct and valuable way of engaging with reality. Perhaps the goal wasn't to transcend and abandon earlier stages, but to integrate them into a flexible repertoire. Perhaps real cognitive maturity wasn't about thinking in the most abstract way possible all the time, but about being able to shift between different modes of thinking, depending on what the situation required. This brings us to something Piaget documented extensively, but that mainstream psychology largely ignored until recently. When he studied children who were transitioning between stages, he noticed they didn't simply wake up one day thinking differently. Instead, they went through periods he called horizontal décalage, where they could apply new cognitive operations in some contexts, but reverted to earlier thinking in others. A child who had mastered conservation with liquid might still fail conservation tasks with clay or number. The new cognitive structure didn't replace the old one uniformly. Instead, it gradually spread across different domains while the old structure remained accessible and sometimes dominant. What Piaget realized, though he never fully developed this insight, was that adults do exactly the same thing. We don't abandon earlier stages. We layer new ones on top while retaining access to previous modes of thinking. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever made a major decision based on how something felt rather than logical analysis, even when you couldn't articulate why? That's accessing pre-operational thinking, where perception and intuition dominate. Have you ever solved a problem by physically manipulating objects, moving things around until the solution became obvious through direct interaction rather than mental planning? That's sensor-motor cognition, the first stage we supposedly outgrow. Have you ever needed to actually see concrete examples before understanding an abstract principle, even in your area of expertise? That's concrete operational thinking asserting itself. None of these are regressions or failures. They're your mind appropriately selecting from its full cognitive repertoire, based on the demands of the situation and the resources available in that moment. Here's where this gets really powerful and really uncomfortable. Our educational systems, professional environments, and cultural values overwhelmingly privilege formal operational thinking. We're taught that analytical, abstract, systematic reasoning is the goal, and anything that looks like emotional, perceptual, or intuitive thinking is something to overcome or suppress. We learn to be embarrassed when we can't immediately articulate logical justifications for our perceptions. We dismiss hunches and gut feelings as unreliable compared to data-driven analysis. We create environments that demand constant abstract reasoning, even in situations where other cognitive modes might be more effective. And in doing so, we systematically impair our access to the full range of human cognitive capabilities that evolution spent millions of years developing. The research on expert intuition reveals this dramatically. Studies of chess masters, firefighters, emergency room doctors, and military commanders consistently show that genuine expertise isn't characterized by more elaborate analytical thinking. Instead, experts develop what researcher Gary Klein calls recognition-primed decision-making. They perceive situations in holistic patterns that trigger intuitive responses, much like pre-operational thinking. A chess master doesn't systematically evaluate every possible move sequence. They look at board configurations and immediately see moves that feel right, then verify those intuitions analytically. An experienced firefighter doesn't methodically analyze every structural indicator. They walk into a building and something feels wrong in ways they cannot articulate, and that feeling saves lives. These experts have actually become more sophisticated by reintegrating earlier cognitive modes rather than transcending them. Piaget documented a specific type of task where children in the pre-operational stage consistently outperform adults. When shown complex visual scenes and asked to remember specific details, young children often perform remarkably better than adults because they're encoding the scene more perceptually and less conceptually. Adults automatically categorize and abstract what they see, losing perceptual detail in favor of conceptual economy. Children simply see more directly. Similarly, studies of creativity consistently show that people who can temporarily adopt childlike perspectives, suspending logical constraints and engaging in apparently illogical associations, generate more innovative solutions. The ability to think like a child isn't something to abandon. It's a cognitive resource with specific applications where it dramatically outperforms adult analytical thought. Now consider how this plays out in your daily life. You're facing a problem at work, something complex and important. Your training tells you to analyze it systematically, break it down into components, evaluate options against criteria, make a data-driven decision. So you do exactly that. You spend hours or days in deep formal operational thinking. And somehow the solution still eludes you, or the solution you generate feels wrong in ways you can't identify, or you implement the logical solution and it fails for reasons that seemed impossible to predict. Then maybe you take a walk, or a shower, or you're doing something completely unrelated, and suddenly the answer arrives fully formed. Not through logical steps, but as a complete perception. That's a different cognitive mode solving what formal operational thinking couldn't. Or think about relationships. Someone you care about is upset. The formal operational approach is to ask questions, gather information, analyze the situation, generate logical solutions. But somehow this makes things worse. They don't want analysis. They want you to feel with them, to perceive their emotional state directly without dissecting it. What they need in that moment is for you to access something closer to sensoromotor empathy, direct emotional attunement without cognitive mediation. If you can't do that because you've been trained to think everything must be processed through abstract analysis, you've actually lost a crucial human capability in the name of cognitive advancement. Here's the practical framework Piaget's work implies but never explicitly articulated. Real cognitive maturity isn't progression through stages ending at formal operations. It's developing what we might call cognitive flexibility, the capacity to recognize which mode of thinking a situation requires and to consciously shift into it. This means several specific things. First, learning to notice when your default cognitive mode isn't working. If you're analyzing something systematically and making no progress, that's information. If you're trying to intuit something and feeling only confusion, that's information. The cognitive mode you're using may be mismatched to the problem. Second, developing the capacity to deliberately shift modes. This isn't mystical, it's a learnable skill. Shifting to more pre-operational thinking means engaging perception more directly, looking at things holistically rather than analytically, allowing impressions and feelings to inform you before trying to articulate logical reasons. Shifting to concrete operational thinking means grounding yourself in specific examples and physical reality rather than abstractions. Shifting back to formal operational thinking means stepping back from immediate experience to analyze patterns and possibilities systematically. Third, learning to trust and articulate insights that come from non-formal operational thinking. This is perhaps the hardest because it requires overcoming decades of cultural conditioning. When you have a strong intuitive sense about something but can't logically justify it yet, you've been trained to dismiss or suppress it. But that intuition might be your pre-operational cognition perceiving patterns that your analytical mind hasn't consciously processed. The skill is holding that intuition seriously while also remaining open to discovering you're wrong. It's treating all your cognitive modes as legitimate sources of information rather than privileging only one. Fourth, creating space for different cognitive modes. If your life is structured as continuous formal operational demands, abstract analysis from the moment you wake until you sleep, you're systematically preventing access to other modes. This is why insight often comes in the shower, during walks, or in that half-awake state before rising. Those are moments when formal operational thinking relaxes and other modes can surface. Let me share something personal that happened during my research that brought this home. I was trying to understand a particularly complex pattern in how children solved certain spatial problems. I had data, I had observations, I had theoretical frameworks. I spent weeks in pure analytical mode, generating hypothesis after hypothesis, none of which quite fit. I was convinced I was missing something, but couldn't identify what. Then one evening I was playing blocks with my young daughter. She was around 4 years old, deep in pre-operational thinking. She was building something, and I asked her what it was. She said it's a house for the shapes to rest. Not a house for people, a house for shapes. Geometric concepts given anthropomorphic qualities. Absolutely illogical by formal operational standards. And in that moment, watching her, something clicked. I suddenly understood that the children in my studies weren't solving spatial problems the way I was analyzing them. They were perceiving space animistically, as filled with intentions and relationships rather than abstract geometric properties. My purely formal operational analysis had been asking the wrong questions because I was trapped in one cognitive mode. My daughter's absolutely childlike, apparently illogical statement was the key because it momentarily pulled me into perceiving the problem more pre-operationally. The military officers who dismissed Piaget's route suggestion made the same error. They were so committed to formal operational analysis that they couldn't take seriously an insight generated by a different cognitive mode. To them, if something couldn't be logically articulated with clear justifications, it was worthless. They had forgotten that some patterns, particularly in complex natural systems, are perceived better through holistic pattern recognition than through analytical decomposition. Piaget's pre-operational perception had seen the map as a living landscape with dangerous configurations, not as a set of quantifiable variables. Both modes have value. The tragedy was that one mode had been culturally deified while the other was dismissed as childish incompetence. This connects to something researchers now call cognitive entrenchment. As you develop expertise in any domain, you build elaborate formal operational structures for thinking about that domain. This is valuable. It allows sophisticated analysis and prediction, but it simultaneously creates barriers to perceiving things that don't fit your frameworks. Experts often perform worse than novices on problems that require seeing familiar situations in genuinely new ways, precisely because their expertise entrenches them in particular cognitive structures. Novices, lacking those structures, more naturally engage other cognitive modes. Children, with less developed formal operational thinking, can see things adults literally cannot because their perception isn't filtered through the same conceptual frameworks. This isn't romanticizing childhood, it's recognizing that cognitive development involves trade-offs, gains in some capabilities through losses in others, unless you consciously work to maintain access to the full range. What does this actually mean for you, practically right now? It means taking seriously those moments when something feels wrong but you can't explain why. Instead of dismissing that feeling because it's not rational, treat it as information from a different cognitive system that might be perceiving something your analytical mind is missing. It means deliberately creating space to engage problems in less analytical ways. If you're stuck on something, stop trying to think harder about it analytically. Go do something physical, something perceptual, something that lets other cognitive modes operate. Walk in nature and just look, without trying to understand or analyze. Draw or build something with your hands. Play with children and enter their cognitive world, rather than trying to educate them into yours. These aren't procrastination or escapes from real thinking. They're engaging the full spectrum of your cognitive capabilities. It means questioning the assumption that articulating logical justifications is always necessary, or even helpful. Sometimes the demand to explain why you believe something forces you to generate post hoc rationalizations that actually obscure the real basis of your insight. If you've perceived something pre-operationally, the true reasons exist at the perceptual level, not the logical level, and trying to make them logical might lead you away from truth rather than toward it. The skill is being able to say, I don't know why I believe this yet, but I'm going to take it seriously while remaining open to being wrong. That's intellectual honesty, not irrationality. It means recognizing that different people might naturally operate in different cognitive modes as their default, and that diversity is valuable rather than a problem to fix. Someone who thinks very concretely isn't failing to think abstractly. They're offering a perspective that can ground and reality test abstract speculation. Someone who thinks very perceptually isn't failing to analyze. They're perceiving patterns that analysis might miss. Instead of trying to make everyone think the same way, we should be building teams and relationships that integrate different cognitive styles. Let me tell you about one more case from Piaget's later work that drives this home. He was studying adolescents, people supposedly in full formal operational thinking, and he gave them a physics problem about pendulums. The task was to figure out what determines how fast a pendulum swings, the weight of the bob, the length of the string, the force of the push, or the release height. Formal operational thinkers should systematically test each variable while holding others constant. Most adolescents could do this eventually, but Piaget noticed something fascinating. Before they started systematic testing, many of them would pick up the pendulum, swing it, play with it physically, get a feel for it sensorimotorly. Then they would look at it for a while, perceiving it holistically, getting impressions pre-operationally. Only then would they begin systematic testing. And those who went through this multimodal process actually solved the problem faster and more reliably than those who jumped straight into systematic formal operational analysis. It was as if the earlier cognitive modes were gathering essential information that made the formal operational work more efficient and accurate. Piaget began to revise his thinking late in life, though he never published a complete reformulation. He started using the phrase progressive equilibration instead of stage progression. The idea was that development isn't about leaving stages behind, but about achieving increasingly sophisticated balance and integration between different cognitive systems. An infant achieving object permanence doesn't abandon sensory-motor cognition. They integrate permanent object representation into sensory-motor exploration, making it more sophisticated. A child achieving conservation doesn't abandon pre-operational perception. They learn when to trust perceptual appearance and when to override it with logical operations. An adolescent achieving formal operational thinking shouldn't abandon concrete and perceptual modes. They should learn to orchestrate all modes flexibly. The most cognitively mature person isn't the most abstract thinker. It's the person who can think in multiple modes and knows when each is most valuable. This completely reframes what cognitive development and education should be about. Instead of rushing children toward abstract thinking and rewarding only that, we should be helping them develop all cognitive modes fully and learn to integrate them. Instead of structuring adult professional life to demand only formal operational thinking, we should be creating environments that invite multiple cognitive modes and value the insights they produce. Instead of feeling ashamed when we think in ways that seem childlike or illogical, we should recognize those as legitimate cognitive capabilities that have specific applications. And instead of dismissing people who think differently than us as less developed, we should be curious about what their cognitive mode might be perceiving that ours is missing. I want you to think about something specific in your life right now where you feel stuck. Maybe it's a work problem, a relationship challenge, a creative project, a life decision. Chances are you've been thinking about it primarily in one cognitive mode, probably formal operational analysis. You've been trying to think your way through it logically, systematically, abstractly, and it's not quite working, or you'd have solved it already. Here's what I want you to consider. What if the reason you're stuck isn't that you're not thinking hard enough or smart enough? What if you're stuck because the cognitive mode you're using is the wrong tool for this particular problem? What if the solution requires perceiving something perceptually that analysis keeps obscuring, or requires grounding in concrete reality that abstraction keeps floating away from, or requires physical engagement that pure mental work can't provide? The question isn't whether you're smart enough. It's whether you're cognitively flexible enough to stop using the tool that isn't working and reach for a different one. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Piaget's work reveals, but that our culture desperately doesn't want to acknowledge. We've built an entire civilization that privileges one cognitive mode, formal, operational, abstract, analytical thinking, and systematically devalues and suppresses all others. We do this in education, testing constantly for abstract reasoning while providing almost no training in perceptual acuity, physical intelligence, or intuitive pattern recognition. We do this in professional settings, rewarding people who can articulate logical justifications while dismissing those who work more intuitively or concretely. We do this in our personal relationships, trying to analyze and explain everything instead of sometimes just being present and feeling directly. And we do enormous damage in the process, both to individuals who feel inadequate because they don't naturally think the culturally preferred way, and to our collective capacity to solve problems that require cognitive modes we've been trained to suppress. The officers who mocked Piaget's childlike logic ended up learning a devastating lesson. The route they considered tactically sophisticated led to death and injury. The route he perceived through apparently primitive cognition would have kept everyone safe. Your cognitive flexibility, your capacity to think like a child when that's what the situation requires, like a concrete pragmatist when that's needed, like an abstract systematizer when that serves, and to shift fluidly between them. That flexibility is perhaps the most valuable cognitive capability you can develop. If this resonates with you, if you're recognizing patterns in your own thinking that have kept you stuck, join us on this journey of discovery. Every week we explore psychological insights that transform how you understand yourself and navigate reality. Subscribe and become part of a community committed to developing genuine cognitive flexibility. And if you want to explore how creativity emerges when we access multiple modes of thinking simultaneously, watch our next video on divergent thinking and the neuroscience of innovation. I'll see you there, you.